How many times this week did you bite your tongue to avoid conflict? How many truths did you bury alive because you feared someone's disapproval? How many times did you silence your own judgment, not because you were wrong, but because you wanted to be liked? Machiavelli called this the most dangerous disease of all, the disease of pleasing. It wasn't power that fascinated him most. It was the quiet self-destruction of those who needed everyone's approval. During his years as a diplomatic envoy for Florence, he watched men rise through charm and collapse through compliance. He saw rulers who traded integrity for affection, strength for softness, principle for peace. They believed kindness would earn loyalty. They believed being loved by all meant being safe. Yet Machiavelli recorded their downfall with surgical precision. Every one of them was betrayed, exploited, and discarded by those they tried hardest to satisfy. Not because they lacked strength, but because the desire to be universally loved came with a hidden cost. It blinded them to reality. It softened their decisions. It turned them into servants of opinion rather than masters of necessity. Machiavelli's most dangerous discovery wasn't that power corrupts, it was that approval does. He learned this not from theory but from blood. In 1502, while observing Cesare Borgia's campaign in the Romagna, he met a man named Ramiro de Lorqua, a governor appointed to pacify chaos. De Lorqua began as a decisive ruler, ruthless, effective, unflinching. He brought order to disorder, but then he made the fatal mistake of softening. He began to crave affection from those he ruled. He hesitated to punish powerful families for fear of their resentment. He wanted to be loved by everyone. And so, Machiavelli wrote to Florence, "The governor now attempts to satisfy all factions, believing this will secure his position. He does not understand that in trying to please everyone, he pleases no one." Within months, Cesare Borgia had him arrested, executed, and cut in half in the public square of Cesena. His corpse was displayed with a bloody knife beside it, a warning carved in flesh. The people who had praised his kindness now celebrated his death. And Machiavelli watched in silence as the crowd cheered for the very cruelty they once condemned. It was in that moment he understood. The pursuit of approval doesn't just fail strategically, it invites annihilation. He saw the faces of those who smiled at weakness and rejoiced at punishment. The need to be liked, he realized, makes a man predictable, pliable, and ultimately expendable. But Machiavelli didn't stop there. He searched for the pattern across kingdoms, across cultures, and found it everywhere. The same disease disguised as virtue. Thus he formed his most unsettling doctrine, the necessity of hatred. A prince, he wrote, must not fear the infamy of cruelty if it keeps his subjects united and loyal. For with a few examples of cruelty, he will be more compassionate than those who, through excessive mercy, allow chaos to arise. To Machiavelli, kindness without discipline was not virtue, it was vanity. And in his cold logic, three truths emerged that shattered every comforting illusion about human nature. First, people respect what they fear more than what they love. Men, he wrote, are less hesitant to offend one who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared. For love is held by a chain of obligation easily broken, but fear is maintained by the dread of punishment that never forsakes you. Love fades with convenience. Fear endures through consequence. This was not cynicism, it was observation. He had seen loyal allies turn traitors the moment affection conflicted with self-interest, while those who feared a ruler's strength remained obedient, even when it cost them. Second, those who try to please everyone inevitably become useful to no one. He who seeks to please all, Machiavelli wrote, pleases none. He witnessed it firsthand in Florence. Leaders who balanced too carefully between rival families, hoping to avoid offense, ended up despised by both. The Medici, though ruthless, maintained power precisely because they dared to be hated by some to serve others decisively. And third, the most damning truth, people exploit those who need their approval. The moment you show a hunger to be liked, you hand others a weapon. They will manipulate your need for validation. They will withhold praise to make you bend. They will threaten rejection to make you yield. He who depends upon the goodwill of others for his security, Machiavelli wrote, has built his house upon sand. That sand shifts the moment it is inconvenient to offer goodwill. Modern research would later confirm his prophecy. Leaders who chase likability over respect collapse under indecision. Negotiators desperate for approval make the worst deals. Organizations led by people-pleasers decay under passive compromise. The truth has not changed in 5 centuries. Approval is the most seductive form of control. But Machiavelli went deeper. He saw that this disease of pleasing infected men in 4 distinct ways, 4 archetypes of self-sabotage. The first was the compromiser, the man who bends with every wind, mistaking flexibility for wisdom. He abandons his principles at the first sign of disagreement. To him, peace matters more than truth. Machiavelli likened him to a reed, always moving, never grounded. No one trusts the man without fixed principles, he wrote. The compromiser seeks harmony even between truth and falsehood, and in the process becomes false himself. Florence's own Piero Soderini embodied this archetype, a good man, a kind man, but a man who tried to please both his allies and his enemies. When the Medici returned to power, all abandoned him. He died in exile, praised as good, remembered as weak. The second was the accommodator, the generous fool who gives everything, believing that selflessness buys loyalty. Machiavelli warned that unstrategic generosity breeds entitlement, not gratitude. Generosity, he wrote, when not guided by necessity, teaches men to expect more generosity. Niccolò Vitelli learned this too late. He built public works, forgave debts, sought to win hearts, but when he needed those hearts to defend him, they turned away. He had trained them not to love him, but to use him. The third type, the conflict avoider, saw clearly what must be done, but lacked the courage to offend. The commander who knows what must be done but refuses to do it because it will offend his men, Machiavelli wrote, is worse than one who does not know what must be done at all. Ignorance can be corrected. Cowardice cannot. Florence suffered for this cowardice during the Pisan Rebellion. Leaders who knew decisive action was necessary but hesitated, fearing disapproval. Their avoidance cost more lives than early courage would have. And finally, the identity pleaser, the rarest and most tragic of all. This person doesn't merely want approval. They require it to exist. Their entire sense of self depends on others' perception. They cannot distinguish between being disliked and being worthless. There are those, Machiavelli wrote, who cannot bear to be hated by anyone, no matter how contemptible. They have made others' opinions more important than their own judgment. This is the most complete form of slavery, the enslavement of the soul. To live constantly scanning for signs of acceptance, terrified of disapproval, is to abandon one's own reason entirely. Machiavelli saw this in Florence's merchant class, those who had built reputations on being agreeable, and who would sacrifice even their own prosperity to protect that image. To overcome this disease, Machiavelli demanded that one confront a brutal truth. You cannot be universally loved and effective at the same time. Because every action, every decision, every truth worth speaking creates opposition. To avoid enemies is to avoid meaning itself. And so he warned of 3 deadly dangers for those who seek approval above necessity. The first was strategic paralysis. The approval seeker becomes incapable of decisive action because every decision offends someone, and in their hesitation they fail everyone. Florence learned this when it tried to remain neutral between France and Spain. Hoping to please both, it was invaded by both. The prince, Machiavelli wrote, who desires to maintain his state must be ready to act against charity, against faith, against humanity, and against religion when necessity requires. The second danger, exploitation by manipulators. Nothing, he wrote, makes a man more vulnerable than the visible need to be thought well of. Those who understand this weakness can guide you with invisible reins. Borgia himself exploited this masterfully. He praised men into dependency, then starved them of approval until they submitted completely. The final danger, the destruction of identity. The moment you define yourself by others' praise, You lose access to your own judgment. You become a mirror of their desires rather than an embodiment of your own truth. Machiavelli saw this tragedy unfold in exile when his former allies, men who once sought his counsel, abandoned him to preserve their reputations with the Medici. They sacrificed wisdom for acceptance, and in their avoidance of hatred, they lost something far greater: their virtue, their capacity for independent action. Thus, Machiavelli came to believe that the acceptance of being hated was not only a political necessity, it was a spiritual discipline. The willingness to be despised for acting according to truth was, to him, the birth of real freedom. He understood what most never will, that the road to greatness is paved with the stones others throw when you stop living for their approval. Most dangerously, Machiavelli discovered that the man who defines himself by the approval of others ceases to be a man at all. He becomes a reflection in 1,000 eyes, and reflections break when the light shifts. He watched this collapse not as an abstract moralist, but as a physician of political life, diagnosing the slow rot that comes from living by other people's applause. When a ruler or a merchant learns to consult the marketplace of opinion before consulting his own reason, he inverts the natural order of judgment. He places the mob on the throne of his intellect and abdicates his duty to reality. The soul that depends on applause loses its appetite for truth. It substitutes convenience for counsel. It replaces conviction with concession. Machiavelli wrote in his letters that he had seen men of great native judgment render themselves fools by making public opinion their guide, rather than their own understanding. They cease to be producers of action and become mere consumers of consent. This is the destruction of virtue, the loss of virtue, the capacity for effective independent action, and it is lethal. When you no longer trust your own judgment because you are forever scanning for the nod of approval, you become incapable of decisive motion. You hesitate when a sword must be upped. You negotiate when you ought to command. You pardon when you should punish. The world will not wait for your permission slips. It moves while you bargain for applause. Machiavelli saw this in his own life. During exile, those who had once sought his counsel abandoned him because association with him endangered their position with the Medici. Men who had once praised his judgment chose reputational safety over wisdom. They sacrificed truth for acceptance, and in doing so they proved his point. Approval is a leash others tighten to harness you. If you want to survive in politics, he taught, you must accept a brutal arithmetic. Every decisive action creates enemies. Every meaningful reform produces opposition. Every boundary you draw disinherits someone. This is not cruelty, it is consequence. Thus Machiavelli devised what he called the path of virtù, a systematic discipline for accepting necessary hatred while preserving strategic effectiveness. It begins with recognition. First, the leader must see that creating enemies is not proof of failure but evidence of action. To be disliked is not the same as to be destroyed. The natural world itself teaches this lesson. The tree that grows tall shades the saplings below and is resented. The predator that takes its prey is hated by those whose offspring are eaten. Existence itself demands competition. Machiavelli's counsel is to account honestly for the times when your need for approval has already cost you power. Make a ledger of hesitation. Remember the moments you failed to act and how those moments multiplied harm. Confront that arithmetic without vanity. Recognition forces you to accept that some hatred is the toll of necessary statesmanship. Phase 2 is strategic hatred. Accepting enmity does not license wanton offense. It requires a surgeon's precision in selecting which battles to fight and which enemies to court. Machiavelli taught that a wise prince must choose his enemies like a general chooses terrain. Some foes prove your relevance. Others merely distract you. Before a major decision, map the opposition. Ask, who will hate this? Why? Will their hatred undermine my authority, or will it testify that I have cut away rot? If the opposition comes from those whose interests are opposed to the reality you enforce, let them hate you. Their hatred will mark your efficacy. If resistance comes from those who are merely misinformed, clarify. If it comes from allies who misunderstand your intent, explain them into cooperation, unless explanation is a betrayal of speed. Distinguish between being hated for your principles and being hated for your temper. The prince should avoid needless offense. He must be hated with dignity, not with pettiness. Be strategic. Accept hatred that proves you are doing something meaningful. Reject hatred that reveals your own moral sloppiness. The outcome of this discipline is paradoxical but inevitable. You will be respected even by those who oppose you because your actions cohere to design and necessity rather than to whim. The final and most perilous phase is psychological independence, the cultivation of internal counsel that outlives ephemeral praise. Machiavelli found his sanctuary not in crowds, but in books and in the courts of the ancients. In exile, he returned to their company, dressing himself in the robes of thought and sipping from a source of counsel that was older than fickle men. Develop sources of worth that are independent of immediate approval. Ancient wisdom, the rigor of practice, a devotion to principles larger than applause. Delay the reflex to poll opinion when making significant choices. Ask first, what do I believe is true and necessary? Only after you have answered that should you ask, what will others think? This inversion is the foundation of autonomous virtue, acting according to necessity while remaining emotionally steady in the face of scorn. Machiavelli's method was not a manual of sadism. It was a training of the spirit. He analyzed history and found models of both successful integration of necessary hatred and catastrophic failure. Cesare Borgia, Machiavelli observed, knew how to wield hatred without losing the people's regard. Borgia understood that to pacify the Romagna required terror and spectacle. He delegated the dirtiest deeds to men like Ramiro de Lorca, and then offered clean public justice that satisfied a populace hungry for order. When de Lorca was executed and his body displayed, the crowd that had once welcomed leniency cheered. Borgia had not sought universal affection. He had sought order. He accepted that some must hate him, particularly the corrupt lords he displaced, and he used that hatred as proof that his reforms cut where they needed to cut. Borgia's state outlasted simple kindness because it embraced the principle that being feared, when measured, secures obedience more reliably than being loved. Contrast this with Piero Soderini, the man of good repute who would not offend a soul, and so offended the whole republic. Soderini's temperament was honorable. His political life was disastrous. He dodged decisive action to avoid making enemies. When the Medici returned, both sides blamed him. Those who despised the Medici for insufficient resistance, and those who supported them for insufficient firmness. He was exiled and died abandoned. Machiavelli's verdict is not a moral indictment so much as a diagnosis. Goodness without backbone is self-defeating in times that demand backbone. The lesson is ruthless and tender at once. Tender because Machiavelli understood the human ache to be beloved. Ruthless because he would not allow that ache to blind statesmen to necessity. He turned inward as well. His own exile was a crucible. The man who had once tried to conciliate every faction discovered that the cost of being liked was exile, torture, and disgrace. In solitude, he rewrote his ethics. Survival, not popularity, must guide decisions. Truth, even when odious, is preferable to flattery. I have learned, he wrote from exile, that the man who sacrifices what he is for what he hopes to be learns the road to his destruction rather than his preservation. That suffering matured into his final counsel. Stop asking, will people like this? And begin asking, is this true and necessary? Machiavelli's program converts the approval seeker into an instrument of reality, someone who understands that to act in accordance with fact and consequence will always create enemies, but that those enemies are the price of being effective. The transformation is not from kind to cruel, but from dependent to sovereign. From someone who needs others to validate his worth to someone who defines worth by alignment with reality and the courage to act upon it. The new leader will still be humane when it suits the policy. He will still be merciful when mercy serves stability. But he will not let the fear of being disliked drive policy at the expense of survival. He will hold his boundaries, exact what is required, and be prepared to bear the noise of condemnation, because he knows the silence of irrelevance is the true death. Machiavelli's teaching culminates in an austere consolation. Being hated by those whose hatred proves you are doing something meaningful is better than being loved by everyone and achieving nothing. If your enemies prove you have cut away corruption, their hatred is confirmation of effect. If everyone loves you, ask what you have altered. The world does not reward inoffensiveness. It rewards consequentiality. So study the mechanics of approval and opposition. Identify which form of the pleasing disease you carry. The compromiser who bends until he breaks. The accommodator who gives until he is drained. The conflict avoider who delays until the disease metastasizes. Or the identity pleaser who cannot bear the idea of contempt and then train directly against that pattern. Make tactical commitments. Limit unstrategic generosity. Quantify the cost of indecision. Schedule moments to consult yourself alone. And practice choosing enemies that prove your purpose rather than expose your weakness. Machiavelli's final merciless mercy is this: the acceptance of necessary hatred frees you to speak truth and act with clarity, and clarity, not congeniality, remakes history. The road is lonely. The climb hard, but isolation is the price of ascent. The higher you reach, the fewer will travel with you. That solitude is not emptiness but altitude. From there you see what the complacent never will. The architecture of cause and consequence, the map of power laid bare. This is why Machiavelli's name survives, because he preferred truth over comfort, reality over reputation. He taught that if you will be a maker of things, you must accept that makers are resented by those who prefer the world as it is. He taught that to rule yourself is to rule others, that the man who masters his need for approval becomes the instrument of necessity, that the only immortality available to mortal men is the work done because it was right, not because it was liked. If you recognize yourself in Machiavelli's portrait of the approval seeker, take this as your beginning. Reckon with your pattern, accept the arithmetic of enemies, choose hatred strategically, and cultivate an inner tribunal that outlasts applause. The alternative is to spend your life being inoffensive and irrelevant, preserved only by the cold comfort of being liked. Will you trade that for consequence? Will you accept the necessary hatred that proves you are doing something meaningful? Decide, because the world will not.